all for being here tonight, and thank you for the warm welcome. It really is my pleasure to speak with you all, especially right before Veterans Day, which we will celebrate tomorrow. I'm very excited to be sharing my research on Civil War veterans and opioid addiction with you this evening. I will plan to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes or so, and then I will open up to questions. And so I'm happy to discuss any of the information that I share tonight in great detail, more perhaps than you will even want to know. So we'll save plenty of room for Q&A at the end. But for now, I will start by saying that in the wake of the US Civil War, there was an epidemic of addiction to opioids among Civil War veterans. And this really was the US's first opioid crisis. And of course, it also happens to be the subject of my forthcoming book, my first book, in fact, titled Opium, Slavery, Civil War Veterans, and Opiate Addiction. I'm pleased to say that recently I found out that it will be published early in 2025 with UNC Press. And so it will soon be arriving at a bookstore or website near you. What I'd like to do this evening is open with a story that I really think illustrates some of the key themes of the book. And that is the story of a man named Alphaeus M. Chappell. He is a Confederate veteran from Amelia County, Virginia, not too far down the road from where I am here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. During the Civil War, he was captain of the 14th Virginia Infantry. And as Chappell would tell it later in his life, a couple of decades removed from the Civil War, he, quote, never got entirely over the wounds that he received at the Battle of Gettysburg, and as he explained in an 1886 letter. Chappell was shot while storming Union Army lines along with General George Pickett's ill-fated Virginia Division on the afternoon of July 3rd of 1863. And when all of the other officers above Chappell's rank in the unit had been shot, it fell to him to lead his regiment, again, the 14th Virginia, through clouds of smoke and bayonets at that fateful afternoon, the Battle of Gettysburg. He never made it to the fence, and that is because a white-hot lead Minette ball stopped him in his tracks when it smashed into his left kneecap at full force. The ball angrily ripped through bone and cartilage, soft tissue, before tearing a huge exit hole in the back of his leg, and so Chappell dropped to the tall, dry grass in unspeakable pain. When the dust finally settled on Pickett's charge, the retreating survivors of the 14th Virginia picked up their captain and dragged him back to a Confederate field hospital. And from there, Chappell hitched a ride back home through Pennsylvania and Maryland, along with the rest of Robert E. Lee's 17-mile-long wagon train, with, of course, Union troops nipping at their heels along the entire way. Every rut and rock in the road would have shook the wagon he was riding in and just added to his already untold misery. Now, as we all know, Civil War battles produce thousands of war stories just like Chappell's. And all too often, of course, these cases ended in grisly deaths from, you name it, infection, blood loss, exposure. So judging by outward appearances, we might consider on its surface Chappell to be one of the lucky ones, that this is one of those positive war stories to come out of the Civil War. And that is because, after all, the captain somehow managed to survive long enough to write down his story in the 1886 letter that we see here on the screen. Chappell, however, didn't see it that way. And that is because to him, every day of survival after the Civil War was a living hell. That is 23 years after Gettysburg, the unexpected consequences of Chappell's Civil War wound dominated his day-to-day life. As Chappell explained in that tortured 1886 letter, quote, the doctors put me on morphine, and I can't stop that. In other words, Chappell had become hopelessly addicted to the morphine that surgeons had given him to treat the pain from his Gettysburg wound sustained at his charge. And although that gunshot wound had long since healed by 1886, the drug given to relieve the pain during the Civil War refused to release Chappell from its chains, and he suffered for it. Nor was Chappell alone. Thousands of Civil War veterans ultimately became addicted to opium and morphine, both during and after the Civil War. In fact, historians have long known that Civil War veterans did occasionally become addicted to medicinal opiates like morphine. For over a century, in fact, scattered cases of addicted Civil War veterans have made occasional appearances in mediums and histories of the Civil War, ranging from an episode of Little House on the Prairie to James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. And the catch, though, is that even though these cases periodically surface in the literature and the memory of the Civil War, addicted veterans like Alphaeus Chappell are almost always relegated to the footnotes, literally. And to me, this is surprising considering that the Civil War era is among the best documented periods of U.S. history, and considering that the U.S. is going through yet another of these cyclical opioid crises. You might think that this would be something that's a sort of well-explored corner of the Civil War era, but in fact, the opposite is true. Today, there remain many unanswered questions about the phenomenon of addiction among Civil War veterans. Why did Civil War veterans become addicted in the first place? Was it merely a few scattered cases, or was there a larger public health crisis occurring in the wake of the Civil War? What were the effects of addiction in veterans' post-war lives? And for their part, how did veterans try to mitigate those consequences? And finally, what does addiction reveal about the longer-term health consequences of the Civil War, which we know unleashed so much suffering on veterans and other survivors in many cases? And so, taking up these questions and others for my book, I assembled a sample of about 200 cases of Civil War veterans who I could verify were addicted to opium, morphine, or laudanum, a related kind of opioid medication. I discovered these cases through a variety of sources, such as 19th century medical journals, mental asylum records, medical advertisements, and of course, pension applications, some of the best sources that historians have available to us documenting Civil War veterans' lives after the war. And so I will be describing some of these sources and my research process as we move through the talk. But ultimately tonight, I'm going to make two key points in the course of telling this story. First, I'm going to argue that the Civil War did in fact cause an epidemic of opioid addiction among Civil War veterans, not merely a few one-off cases, but rather a larger public health crisis that grew out of the war. Secondly, I will also show how addiction really did dominate veterans' post-war lives to the point that few of them, like Chappell, consider themselves to have gotten over the Civil War, which I think is traditionally how most of us sort of imagine Civil War veterans as they reintegrated into post-war society. But before we get to these points, let's start at the beginning. Let's start with causation. What caused Civil War veterans to become addicted to opiates? What sparked this broad addiction epidemic? Well, the Civil War, to kind of sum it up simply, was a massive public health crisis. Yes, it was a war about slavery. It was a diplomatic falling out between the North and the South. But from a human point of view, it was also a giant medical disaster. In fact, it was the biggest public health crisis in American history up to that point. The war caused a really mind-bogglingly huge number of people to get sick, to have acute and chronic pain. To put a number on it, there were about 1.5 million casualties stemming up from the war out of about 31 million Americans. So to put that in human terms, almost every American family would have known of or included someone who got sick or hurt during the Civil War. It was a medical crisis that Americans living through this conflict could not escape. Recruits, in fact, joining the Army in 1861 had a 1 in 4 chance of not returning back home at all by 1865. And of course, those who did return, like our protagonist, Alphaeus Chappell, often did come back with shattered limbs, injured bodies, and very long-term, lifelong health conditions. And so to deal with this unprecedented health crisis, doctors really did have to double down on tried and true medical therapies, which in the 1860s were opiate drugs. Opium, which we see here, an opium poppy on the left-hand side of the screen, is a very old drug. It is one of humankind's oldest known medical therapeutic substances, in fact. Doctors had been prescribing opium and its various derivatives, including morphine and laudanum, for centuries and centuries. During the 1800s, these narcotic substances were actually some of the only effective painkillers known until several decades after the Civil War. And so unpredictably, by the time that the Civil War breaks out in 1861, opium and its derivatives are actually the most commonly prescribed medications in the United States. Opium was present in about 50% of all prescriptions written by physicians in the US during these mid 19th century decades. So that fact alone kind of boggles my mind when we compare this environment of really heavy opioid prescribing to today, when these substances tend to be very tightly controlled. The reason that opiates were so popular is because they were utilitarian. We think today of opioids primarily as painkillers. For example, you might be given morphine in a hospital while recovering from surgery. Until recently, you might be prescribed OxyContin for chronic back pain. But in the 19th century, these drugs were useful for so much, much more than just painkillers. In fact, by my count, and at one point I did have to sit down and count, in the mid 1800s, opiates were used to treat around 150 different medical ailments, ranging from diarrhea to cholera, pneumonia, insomnia, and even toothaches, especially among children. I think, in fact, of opium and its derivatives as being kind of like Tylenol plus Pepto-Bismol plus NyQuil all combined into one convenient package. We can imagine how that would sell out of CVS or Walgreens like hotcakes. That's sort of the situation in the mid 1800s. Now, antebellum doctors going into the Civil War knew in the back of their minds that opiates were addictive and poisonous if taken in large doses. In fact, this knowledge does go all the way back to the era of the American Revolution, when some of the first doctors in the United States, like Benjamin Rush, treated cases of addiction, even among the first families of Virginia. But although addiction was known, it was not necessarily sort of at the forefront of medical or even cultural concerns before the Civil War, when for the first time, a large group of men are going to get addicted to these substances. And of course, I'm talking about soldiers and veterans. It's also worth mentioning that, of course, doctors and healthcare consumers also had no alternatives to opiates because few other drugs were so effective. And so all of that is to say that during the Civil War, facing an unprecedented surge in demand for effective medications, Army surgeons relied very heavily on opiates to treat things like pain and diarrhea. So think of those kind of quintessential Civil War injuries like gunshots and amputation, but also think of the most commonly encountered medical concerns during the Civil War, which were dysentery and what was referred to as chronic diarrhea. Opiate use during the Civil War is going to go off the charts. So it was already quite high going into the war, but the war will cause even more and more opiate consumption. The Union military, for its part, used about 2.3 million fluid ounces of liquid opiates, so morphine, and about 10 million opium pills. In fact, the Union military is going to go through so much opium that the federal government actually had to found pharmaceutical labs in the cities of New York and Philadelphia to manufacture mass quantities of opiates for the first time in US history. You might be wondering, what about the Confederacy? For the Confederacy's part, of course, they're dealing with a blockade that's increasingly effective as the war drags on. So they eventually did start to run out of opium. And to resolve the situation, they tried, in fact, to grow opium poppies on slave plantations at various places in the South. And when that failed, the Confederacy even attempted to coax civilian women and children to cultivate private opium gardens and donate the contents to their local Confederate hospitals, although that plan fizzled out for various reasons that I'm happy to elaborate on. In any case, surgeons doled out opiates both north and south liberally and in ways conducive to an epidemic of addiction. To give you an example, at one Union hospital, a place called Turner's Lane in Philadelphia, where Union surgeons were experimenting with different kinds of surgeries to treat very severely wounded Union and Confederate veterans, surgeons at this facility gave some 40,000 morphine injections to wounded and sick soldiers in just 12 months during the Civil War. In fact, they gave so many injections of hypodermic morphine, when they published their results, Turner's Lane actually helped to popularize the medical device of the hypodermic syringe in American medication. And so after the war, injections of morphine become so much more common for a variety of different reasons. These medications, I can't underscore enough, were really, really crucial and important substances just from a logistical point of view for Civil War armies. Soldiers simply could not have functioned for long in the battlefield or in camp without them. The Confederate Army Medical Handbook put it like this, quote, opium is the one indispensable drug on the battlefield, important to the surgeon as gunpowder to the ordnance. And for me, this image that we see on the slide of a Civil War hospital worker posing with a mortar and pestle and various different medicine bottles, this image really illustrates the centrality of opiates to the war effort. This individual is telling us medicines are important to the functioning of armies, and that's why he chooses to kind of pose himself in this way. So there's a fascinating example of the kinds of sources we can use to learn about this phenomenon. These, for our purposes, are perhaps even more interesting. These are actual Civil War prescriptions containing opiates. Part of my work has involved sifting through these Civil War prescriptions and prescription books to try to quantify opioid prescribing data and to parse these usage patterns both in and out of Civil War hospitals. So if you look very closely, you can see in the image on the right, these are basically compound medicines that are mixed up by hospital workers before they're given to patients suffering from various ailments or soldiers suffering from various ailments. Those red underlines that we see in these columns in the image are opium or other opiate ingredients in these prescriptions. Now, predictably, many soldiers, of course, are going to become addicted to opiates during the Civil War through surgeons' prescriptions for pain and sickness. For example, at Turner's Lane Hospital, we have the case of one particular Union veteran who underwent not just one amputation, but in fact 6 amputations and re-amputations to fix the initial botched surgery over the span of 3 years. So imagine this individual ends up in the hospital at the beginning of the war, is constantly being operated on. Finally, 3 years later, he is discharged after the 6th surgery, when the man's surgeon recorded in 1865 that he was free to go home, he had been healed, except for he had developed what the surgeon could only describe as a craving for opium. And that's sort of 19th century speak for addiction before the word addiction became very common in medical lingo. And so again, that is to say that surgeons' prescriptions are one conduit to developing addiction to opiates during the Civil War. There are other pathways as well, however. Surgeons were not the only source of opium or morphine. Veterans, in fact, learned how to use these substances from their fellow soldiers to the point that camp life during the Civil War served as a kind of process of acculturation to opioid use. Soldiers would often send letters back home asking for their families to mail to them packets of opiate patent medicines and opium pills. And they would dispense these to their messmates, or they would receive them from their comrades, to the point that, fast forward to the post-war era, when Civil War veterans got sick later in life, they instinctually reached for the morphine bottle, again, because they had learned during the Civil War that these medicines could be effective. Now, if we consider this phenomenon, this growing opioid crisis that's sort of bubbling up out of the ethos of the Civil War, in context of sort of the broader cultural concerns of the 19th century, we might be wondering, how did the temperance movement, the temperance crowd, were they concerned about the potential for an addiction crisis in the ranks? Absolutely. They worried deeply about both alcohol and opioid abuse in Civil War armies, and then as veterans returned home, this sort of spreading into the post-war atmosphere. These fears did in fact come true. Self-medication, both during and after the Civil War, was a major vector for addiction. For example, there was a Confederate soldier from the 9th Alabama Infantry named George House. He got in the habit of taking a dose of morphine right before he would go into battle, because the drug, he wrote, helped him to kind of calm his nerves and cope with the carnage that he was about to endure. Decades later, in the year 1881, I discovered George House's case on the patient register, an admissions book, basically, of the Charity Hospital in New Orleans, one of North America's oldest hospitals, where he checked himself in seeking addiction treatment for his morphine use, again, 20 years after the Civil War. I do think it's worth pointing out, of course, that although opiates are pretty freely flowing both in Civil War hospitals and in camps, some veterans were much more likely to become addicted to these substances than others. And so I'd like to speak a little bit about the demographics of addiction. White veterans, I've found, were far more likely to become addicted than Black Union veterans. Although Black soldiers and sailors made up roughly 10% of the Union military, they were not proportionately represented in the cohort of addicted Civil War veterans after the war. I mean, 10%, you might think that that would translate to a good number of addicted Black veterans, but I found this was actually not the case for various reasons. One reason for that are ideas about medicine that are developed under the slavery system prior to the Civil War. American doctors that are practicing in Civil War military and civilian hospitals believed, for the most part, that the bodies of Black Civil War soldiers could not feel pain as acutely or sensitively as white Civil War soldiers. And so there was this kind of racial belief that Black and white soldiers experienced pain differently. This belief is developed on Southern plantations where doctors would be called in to treat enslaved people. It was really an attempt kind of to fend off abolitionist criticisms of slavery. But if we fast forward to the Civil War and carry this belief, through to where the rubber meets the road, because of this idea, addicted Black soldiers were actually far less likely during the war to be given or to be prescribed opiate painkillers. For example, in one case, a Black veteran's foot was cut basically in half by shrapnel, but he was not given morphine by the surgeon that treated him in an Army hospital because, as the surgeon explained, quote, the soldier was not suffering much pain. Now, for this sort of injury, the standard of care for white soldiers was morphine early and often, but that was not necessarily the case for Black soldiers in the Union military. The same is also true of diarrheal ailments, which was probably the most commonly the most common situation in which one would have been given opiates during the Civil War to treat diarrhea. Mortality from diarrheal sicknesses like dysentery and chronic diarrhea among white troops was a relatively low 17.3%. As I say that, we are talking about the Civil War, so relatively low, as only 17% of soldiers die of diarrhea. But in contrast, the death rate for Black troops suffering from diarrheal ailments was 34%, or nearly double that of white soldiers. And this staggering disparity really is emblematic of kind of the racism that's built into Civil War medicine that translated to these different prescribing patterns between the races. It's also worth mentioning that this is parallel with today's opioid crisis, when African Americans are still widely underprescribed opioid painkillers. Now, fast forward to the Civil War's end in April of 1865, thousands of veterans are going to return home to American cities, to American farms, suffering from all manner of life-altering medical problems. They're missing limbs, they have half-healed gunshot wounds, they are suffering from gastrointestinal effects of starvation in POW camps. And so there was a continued need for these opiate medicines long after Civil War armies disbanded. So Gilded Age doctors in the 1870s, 1880s, and even into the 1890s continued to prescribe opiates to ailing veterans very liberally after the war, which also facilitated addiction. One doctor, in fact, a guy named George Jones of Cincinnati, no relation, gave about 2,300 injections of morphine to a single pain patient over the course of about a year and a half in the wake of the Civil War.
Wow.
And that is a huge, that's a massive amount of prescriptions to just one pain patient that would have almost certainly been conducive to developing dependence or addiction. This was normal. This was very, very standard in the wake of the Civil War. For context, there were no legal standards or really even medical guidelines that were agreed upon for doctors to follow when prescribing these dangerous narcotics. There were no laws to prevent consumers from taking a prescription from a doctor and refilling it at a pharmacy however many times they wanted to. You didn't even need a prescription, in fact, because these drugs were available over the counter well into the early 20th century. You could even buy them from a store called Sears and Roebuck's for about $1.50, and you would get a vial of morphine with 2 syringes in the mail. And so all of that is to say that the conditions for a public health crisis are ripe, and they're created by the Civil War. We see this really escalating into ever higher heights as the post-Civil War decades unfold. For example, in Stanton, Virginia, just down the road from where I am in the Shenandoah Valley, pharmacists in the city dispensed about 79,000 doses of opium in a year during the 1870s. So much opium, in fact, that the New York Times labeled Stanton as, quote, the great opium city of Virginia, because so many folks were buying opium and using opium in the area. In fact, according to the Times, opium eating, another 19th century phrase for addiction, was, quote, like an epidemic. It is in the atmosphere of the post-war Shenandoah Valley, which of course had been devastated by the war. In Virginia and elsewhere, really an addiction epidemic was born with the Civil War and grew out of control in the aftermath of the conflict. For what it's worth, I was surprised by how long the addiction crisis lasted. This is a finding that I kind of stumbled into that really made my head spin a little bit. This is not something that goes away in the decades following the Civil War, but in fact, it continues on and on into the early 20th century. It really was one of the longer term health consequences of the Civil War. One Confederate veteran, for example, appeared at a Louisiana drug rehab clinic in the year 1920, where he told doctors that he had been addicted to morphine. He had been taking it every day since the Civil War, more than 5 decades before. He was not alone either. A Union veteran, a guy named Perry Bowser, became addicted to morphine in a Vicksburg military hospital in 1864. In 1915, he died of a condition that his doctors referred to as chronic morphinism. And so that means that these individuals lived 2/3 of their lives addicted to a drug that they were first exposed to during the Civil War. Of course, an epidemic, for something to be labeled an epidemic, requires not just a large number of cases that can be traced back to a particular event or vector, it also requires recognition. People have to be aware that there's a large number of clustered cases or perceive that such an event is occurring. And so, that raises the question, did people after the Civil War associate addiction not just with Civil War veterans, but did they trace that back to the war itself? The answer is yes. In fact, during the Gilded Age, addiction among veterans was so widely recognized and reported on that it actually became a stereotype about veterans at large. One Boston pharmacist summed up this stereotype in 1872 when he reported to the Massachusetts Board of Health that, quote, veteran soldiers as a class are addicted. And so it is, again, such a commonplace phenomenon that it's widely associated with the men that survived the Civil War, who become the first group of individuals really associated with opioid addiction in US history. So that's how the addiction epidemic started with the Civil War. But what was it like for veterans to be addicted to opiates back then? Uncovering this experience of addiction for veterans in the 1800s was a major part of my book. And so what I learned from investigating this opioid crisis from this particular angle really is that addiction cost veterans everything: their livelihood, their self-esteem, military entitlements, families, in some cases their freedom, and even their lives. One major reason for this is that so-called slavery to opium, again, another one of these 19th century ways of describing addiction before the word addiction was in common use. Slavery to opium defied cultural ideals about how Civil War veterans were meant to behave. For example, it was seen to be addicted to morphine or opium was seen by the Civil War generation as something that was unmanly. There were several reasons for this. Prior to the Civil War, most addicted people in the antebellum era had been women. Also, the behaviors exhibited by Civil War veterans to kind of people watching them were perceived as unmanly. And so that fed into this idea that to be addicted was to be less than manly. An example of that is pain relief. Remember, these drugs are used very commonly for pain after the Civil War. For a man to need morphine for a decades-old war wound that might appear to have healed was a kind of cultural anathema, because men were supposed to sort of grit their teeth and bear it rather than have to rely on a drug for something that had supposedly long since healed. My favorite example, though, that illustrates this idea, again, that opioid addiction was inherently unmanly, is actually what opioids did to Civil War veterans' physical appearance over days, months, weeks, and years. Long-term opioid use dramatically changes the body. One of the phenomenons that's so associated with chronic opioid use is extreme weight loss and fatigue. And so this really did defy the ideal male body image. Men during this time period were supposed to be these like barrel-chested, strong, sort of Teddy Roosevelt looking guys, sort of like the individual here on the left. Yet addiction meant that veterans could not live up to this ideal. They defied how men were supposed to look. Some of the veterans that I study for my book lost upwards of 50 pounds, and they literally appeared to their families, their doctors, government officials to be skeletal in appearance, much like the individual that we see here on the right. Um, one of the guys that I write about in my book, to give you an example, was named George Gardner. He is a U.S. Navy veteran who serves during and after the Civil War, gets addicted to hypodermic morphine. By the time that he checked into a medical facility for veterans in Indiana, he was weighing just 100 pounds. And so that's a huge amount of weight loss from a height of about, or from a maximum weight of about 150 during the Civil War. Even the skin of these individuals appeared to onlookers to be disturbing and unmanly in a lot of ways. For example, Gardner's skin, like that of many other hypodermic morphine users during this era, was absolutely covered from head to toe with needle puncture marks. It would have looked something like this image. Doctors were horrified because they believed that for someone like George Gardner to inject themselves over and over and over while clearly causing self-harm, they believed that this was an expression of a lack of self-control, which of course made one seem unmanly. Eventually, the effects of opiate addiction over years and weeks, over the long term, got so bad that men also became unable to work. So it wasn't just the weight loss or the skin; it was also the fatigue. Um, when these veterans were addicted over the long term, they also lost really the ability to focus at work without, using morphine, and so it was just a tremendously combustible situation physically. And because this is such a combustible situation, veterans often became quite isolated from their families and their communities. For example, the couple that we see here on the slide, John and Fanny Gulrick, or Frances Gulrick of Fredericksburg, Virginia. John was a teenage Confederate soldier who was shot in the leg during the siege of Petersburg. As he grew up after the war, he became addicted to opium to cope with the pain. Yet the couple kept his addiction secret because they worried that it would be something that would sort of discredit the family's name if it came out in the papers. In fact, Fanny wrote a letter at one point where she worried that John's, quote, weakness and folly would get leaked to the press and bring shame to the family. John, for his part, promised his wife over and over that he would quit, but each time he did so, he would eventually relapse. And this occurs multiple times, every time a rift grew between the couple. By the time that the couple reached the year 1896, John relapsed for the last time. Fanny came home to their Fredericksburg house. Again, this is in the year 1896. She opens the front door. She is shocked, or perhaps not shocked, to find John overdosed on morphine. She snapped and threatened to abandon him. She rushed upstairs to write a series of angry letters to her family, declaring that she would file for divorce. And so, in a rare letter describing a case of Civil War veterans' opioid addiction from the family's perspective, family wrote to her brother that, quote, John will beg and implore me not to do this, not to file for divorce, but I must, for I can bear this neither for myself or for the children any longer. And so this is just one of many examples of how addiction could not only cost veterans their manhood and their bodies, but also their families. Now, eventually, Fanny's family managed to kind of talk her down from the ledge, but that raised the question what to do about John. The family couldn't let him continue this cycle of relapse over and over and over again. Families like the Gulricks had certain means available to them. As we can see from their clothing, the Gulricks were quite wealthy. And so oftentimes the families of wealthy Civil War veterans opted for what was known as home care. What that looked like in the case of the Gulricks is that for months after Fanny discovered her overdose husband, again in 1896, the Gulricks' extended family took John to a rural cabin outside of Fredericksburg, locked him in a room, and forced him to detox under armed guard, cold turkey. And this was a terrible ordeal, lasted for weeks on end. And John was actually quite lucky to have survived because you can, in fact, die from this kind of detox. Nevertheless, it did rip a huge hole in the family that never quite healed. Pensions are also another good example of kind of the tangible costs of addiction in veterans' lives. After the Civil War, the US government and individual states in the former Confederacy created massive pension programs for Civil War veterans and their families. These programs, of course, set the stage for things like Social Security in the 20th century. But access to these entitlements was contingent on a veteran's standing in the community, his manhood, his reputation. And of course, so-called opium slaves were looked down upon by their communities and their families, and so they were usually denied pensions. One example is a Union Army veteran named Samuel Martin. He was so unequivocally denied a pension when he applied that someone at the Pension Bureau literally pasted a note on his pension application saying, quote, "This claimant is a morphia eater." And so we can see basically that note is the 19th century equivalent of a sticky note that someone would have put on top of this person's pension application in case he appealed. They wanted it known that this person was not deserving of a pension because of these ideas that so stigmatized addiction back then. As if losing out on pensions and families and physical appearances and reputations wasn't bad enough, many veterans actually ended up in mental asylums. Back in the late 1800s, there were no laws against using drugs, but the state had other means of policing addiction kind of in a roundabout way, and that is through laws that would allow families and communities to institutionalize veterans suffering from addiction. So oftentimes, again, veterans did end up effectively locked up in these facilities where they were de facto incarcerated for decades. In 1882, for example, a Confederate veteran named Henry Garrett was committed to Virginia's Western State Hospital, also located coincidentally in Stanton, the great opium city of Virginia. For the diagnosis that he was institutionalized for was ill health and opium. And in 1898, 17 years later, he died at the facility. And so again, all that is to say that to be known as an opium slave could oftentimes literally translate to a loss of freedom for Civil War veterans. It goes without saying that these asylums are not nice places. Oftentimes, folks were chained up, they were tortured, they were also made to work for free without compensation. And so really, these were sort of de facto prisons in the era before you could actually go to jail for opioid addiction. To bring us to a close, my hope is that by telling this story, by uncovering these cases of Civil War veterans that got addicted to these very dangerous and depressing narcotics and traced their addictions back to the Civil War, I hope that by uncovering the story and reckoning it will help us today better understand the surprising and often quite tragic legacies of the Civil War for individual Americans. I think we often so often we focus on the battles. That's the stuff that we kind of like to talk about. And the aftermath flies under the radar, gets overlooked. But as we've seen in these cases, for many Civil War veterans, the war never really stopped. It turned into this kind of unending cycle of trauma. And so ultimately, that's what I'm trying to uncover with this book. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. And again, thank you for your time tonight.
Very nice. Let me do a little gallery view. We do have some comments, and I'll be reading these to you, Jonathan. Mary says, Papa what? Yeah, will not live below zone 6, nor will any other poppies. Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is a really interesting facet of the story that I just kind of obsessed over when I first encountered on this research is the different ways that they tried to procure opium in the Confederacy. They really were quite desperate for these medications because they were so essential to the functioning of Civil War armies, and so they tried them in any combination of soils, humidity levels, you name it, they tried it in the Confederacy, and they never were quite able to pull together a large-scale opium production, situation as people were in the North.
Paul says provocative, well organized, tight presentation supported by solid research. No wasted words, no intellectual wandering. A delight to experience this ilk of scholarship.
Well, I think my students might disagree with the lack of intellectual wandering there, but I appreciate it.
Bill would like to know, can you elaborate about the development of syringes and needles? Current day needles seem to be as small as hair. And
Mm.
it seems that needles in the 1800s must have been of a much larger diameter.
Yes, these were not the friendly needles that we encounter in doctors' offices today. These were like huge, very high gauge, painful devices to use. They also they were relatively new. The syringe, the hypodermic syringe, is invented in Europe on the eve of the U.S. Civil War. European doctors had some experience with the device, but only a few Americans had really experimented with it enough to understand it going into the Civil War. Of course, those doctors were recruited by the medical services of the Union and the Confederacy, and so in Civil War hospitals, these guys who knew how to operate these hypodermic syringes knew where to inject morphine, knew how to get it in the right, angle, to make the speediest pain relief. They became sort of like the Clara Bartons of the battlefield. They were bringing pain relief. And so they taught their fellow surgeons how to use the device, but it was not without a lot of experimentation. These early hypodermic needles, sometimes if we think about kind of how a hypodermic needle is pointed, some of these early syringes did not use pointed needles, so it was kind of like they were jamming a cylinder into the skin without the ability to pierce the skin, could leave these huge bruises. They also, of course, were not aware of bacteria and germs, and so these needles were oftentimes used from one patient to the next, to the next, to the next, without being sanitized. And so that image that I showed of a Civil War veteran, or rather a morphine user, just covered, from head to toe in needle puncture wounds, we think that that was actually more likely to be infections from using an unsanitized needle. And so that was a byproduct of this experimentation with these hypodermic syringes. Of course, they work. If you can figure out how to use them, they work. And so they sort of spread like wildfire in the US after the Civil War. They were also not regulated, much like the narcotics. And so if you wanted a hypodermic syringe, you could buy one. If you could get someone to show you how to use it, you could use that, on a day-to-day basis.
Robert would like to know, where were the sources of opium during and after the Civil War?
That's a great question. These most of the opium poppy. So opioids are in the 1800s derived from the opium poppy, a plant that is mostly grown at this point in time in places like India. It is sourced globally and imported into the United States, both before, during, and after the Civil War. Most opium is an imported substance, and so basically this drug would originate in India, also in Turkey. That was another major source of opium back then. Would be sort of funneled off around the globe through the maritime trade to different places. So some of it would end up famously in China, where it fueled things like the Opium Wars in the 1840s. As the US becomes very heavily involved in trade with Asia during the 1800s, a lot of that opium is going to flow here into places like New York City, New Orleans, where it's kind of slowly distributed out through canals and railroads and all that jazz. And so all of that is to say that most of it comes from abroad. It's also quite cheap because there's a huge flood of it. And as transportation methods in the 1800s make the cost of travel and shipping cheaper and cheaper, the price of these drugs only goes down, down, down. And so they become even more accessible as the crisis grows.
Robert would also like to know, did opium addiction happen in the Union Army? He said that he missed the beginning of the talk.
Mm. Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is I was quite shocked to find that addiction cases were really common in both armies. I had assumed when I started this project that the Confederacy, it's blockaded. They're probably going to run out of morphine. So, maybe there would be fewer Confederate veterans who were addicted to these drugs. What I found was the opposite. Both Confederate veterans and Union Army soldiers and veterans are being exposed to these drugs, using them, being prescribed these drugs at really high rates during the war and after the war. Part of the crisis is fueled by a really quick effort among American doctors in the North and the South to sort of reunify themselves. And so after the war, politically, there's this process of kind of reunifying the country during Reconstruction. An equivalent process goes on with American medicine. Doctors had been split during the war, Northern and Southern acquaintances had sort of separated, but after the war, they rushed to reforge these alliances. And so it just basically negates the effects of the blockade really quickly. And so morphine is accessible in the post-war South. Confederate veterans and Union veterans alike have a high uptake of these substances.
Michael would like to know, what was the standard treatment for opiate addiction in the years after the Civil War?
Great question. A lot of my book deals with questions like that. Like, what did the doctors do about it? How did they wrap their heads around this? What really was the U.S.'s first opioid epidemic? We know from our times, for example, that doctors often get kind of the blame for overprescribing opioids and for fueling the opioid crisis. And the same was very much true in the wake of the Civil War. Veterans are going to get blamed in a lot of cases, for example, by the Pension Bureau for being addicted. But for their part, veterans flip that around and blame the doctors. And so, really, surgeons from the Union and Confederate armies, they go after the war and resume their civilian practices. Suddenly, in the 1870s and 1880s, the profession, the medical profession, comes under a lot of fire from Civil War veterans that had a really prominent public place in post-war society. So veterans' criticisms of doctors carried a lot of weight, and it put doctors on their back foot, and they had to really scramble to come up with ways to treat those patients that they were being blamed for causing addiction. And so one of the really common ways to treat cases of addiction back then was actually pretty similar to how it's done today in rehabs. It was basically the tapering down method. In whether it was in mental asylums or in these kind of private drug rehabs that pop up after the Civil War, you effectively would be sent there, or you would go there of your own volition. Whatever your kind of normal dose was, the next day the doctor would give you a little less, and a little less, and a little less. And this was seen as being the most humane way to sort of get a person from the place where they're using a lot of dangerous opioids to where they're using hopefully no opioids. It kind of worked, but back then they didn't know really as much as we do about kind of the brain, how the brain and addiction works. And so they could not account for things like relapses. And so, really, one of the tragedies of this opioid crisis is that a lot of folks would get this kind of tapering down treatment. A few months or a few years later, they would have a craving, they would relapse, and they were sort of extra blamed for that because they had already gone through treatment and no one really had a good explanation other than them being like a weak man, supposedly a bad person, for explaining this kind of behavior. So it really is a tragedy. I think we do, though, see a lot of parallels again between the past and the present.
Michael would also like to know how opiates were used. Were they oral? Were they liquid or pills, intravenous, or intramuscular injection?
Ooh, that's a fascinating question. You name it, they tried it. Literally. I mean, they tried to get these drugs into the body in any possible way. Some, the sort of traditional way that's developed in the antebellum era that has roots all the way back in the Stone Age in Europe is to swallow the drug. And so opium, which in this day and age was delivered as kind of a powder, so it would literally be sort of a powdery substance. Sometimes they would mix it with soap and turn it into the 19th century version of a pill, which really looked more like a dog treat than a modern day capsule pill. But anyways, they would make these pills, they would cut them up into dozens, and then you would swallow them. Another common way is to turn opium into a liquid form. And so that's where we get things like morphine, or even more commonly used before the Civil War was a mixture of opium and alcohol. It was called laudanum. I mean, you can imagine how potent this drug is. It is basically dispensed in little vials. And so you would take a drop or two out of the vial, you would swig it, and then, there you are. During the Civil War, injections become pretty common, although not as common still as taking the oral approach. But injections into any part of the body, that you can imagine is occurring. Civil War surgeons found the most success with injecting morphine directly into the wounded part of a soldier's body. And so if a man came in, they had an amputation, the morphine might be given when the person wakes up by just injecting it directly into the stump. And that sounds really graphic, but I mean, this is the process of trial and error that doctors and patients are undergoing during the Civil War.
Bill says that I've read a lot of newspapers in the era, and
Hmm.
opium was widely advertised. Do you know when that stopped?
Yeah, great question. That's also one of the things that really surprised me is that these drugs are you can't hardly open up a newspaper in the Civil War era without coming across a classified advertisement for wholesale opium, opium pills at your local pharmacy, or increasingly after the Civil War, for medicines that purported to cure opiate addiction. Those kinds of advertisements were also really common. It's not until the early 20th century that that starts to change. In really what historians call the progressive era, sort of the 1910s, 1920s, there's this push, in part led by doctors, but also in part led by kind of sort of moral reformers, anyways, there's this push to kind of crack down on the overprescribing of opium, but also sort of the open advertising of these kinds of dangerous narcotics. And so that's really when the situation changes. By the time that you get to like 1930, 1940, you can't really open up a newspaper and spot those advertisements anymore. That's also the era when, for the first time at a federal level, narcotics, including opioids, are regulated by the government. And so that starts in 1914, several years actually before the prohibition of alcohol.
Bonnie would like to know, were opiates among the medications that relief organizations,
Mm.
particularly the U.S. Sanitary Commission, were requested to supply? And if yes, how much was requested?
Yeah, fascinating question. The answer is definitely yes. The Sanitary Commission is really proud of the amount and the different kinds of war relief that they're able to channel into the Union Army and into the war zone. So it's not a surprise that they're very proud of the amount of morphine and opium that they're able to procure on behalf of the Union Army. And they're just sending, tons and tons of these drugs into Union Army hospitals and other places where soldiers and veterans are being treated. It's hard to know exactly how much because the Sanitary Commission, um, the local sort of chapters of the commission would all kind of keep their own records, and they were never really centralized very well after the Civil War. And so we have records from individual sort of local, parts of the Sanitary Commission that say, we raised, 17 bottles of morphine and sent them to the field hospital at Chancellorsville. But we don't know on a national scale. We do know, however, that the Union Army, the federal government, is absolutely desperate for these medications. And so if the Sanitary Commission can provide them, the government is happy to receive them. And of course, the government goes so far as to create their own pharmaceutical laboratories to just churn out more and more opium and morphine. So for me, what that says is that the government did not have as much opium as it would have liked to have gotten from the Sanitary Commission.
Paul says your concluding remarks speak volumes to the issue veterans face about combat injuries, including TBI and especially PTSD, and having them recognized as legitimate combat injuries, not to mention of negative dimensions of coming forward to seek professional intervention.
Yeah, that's really one of the things, the facets of this story that I think is a real tragedy. It's almost as a, the Civil War is it happened 150 years ago. So the situation that these veterans endured a century and a half ago, if I took the sort of dates out of it and I, gave it as if it was a modern day topic, you might not be able to distinguish between a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan who's enduring these same kinds of phenomena versus a Civil War veteran. Actually, I did try that out once. I gave a presentation when I was in graduate school, kind of framing it as a modern day story, but it was in fact the case of a Civil War veteran. I asked the audience to tell me whether it was a case from now or back then, and they unanimously said it was from now. And so again, just the fact that this can happen 150 years ago and happen again in our own times without any kind of real difference there, other than the power of the narcotics and the amount of money that people are making off of them, that to me is a real head scratcher. It seems if we take this concept also and apply it to the broader state of veterans healthcare for all kinds of different conditions like PTSD and TBI, we seem to be in the US constantly sort of lagging behind the sort of ill consequences of war that veterans are enduring. So I would like, at some point in the future as a military historian, to see a world where the government can anticipate what soldiers might be enduring after combat, and try to sort of roll with the punches before the punches land. But I don't think we're quite there yet.
James would like to know, were opiates ever used for what we would now consider mental illness or PTSD, like soldier's heart, related to the war?
Yeah, absolutely. So opium is in fact one of the drugs that was recommended by the Civil War surgeon who discovered soldier's heart, a guy named Jacob DaCosta. He was sort of a bigwig in the medical scene in Philadelphia. He becomes a contract surgeon for the Union Army. After the war, he goes back home and he writes a really famous study that's very widely circulated in the American medical press, where he describes he called it soldier's heart. We today think that it sounds very suspiciously like PTSD, before there was a label, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we think that that's probably what he was observing, although we'll never know conclusively. But one of the treatments that he recommended for soldiers experiencing soldier's heart, which involved hallucinations and a rapidly beating heart and things like that, was opium to calm the patient down. And so it is definitely one of these treatments. Of course, the irony there is that in the 1800s, doctors thought that if a person took too much opium for too long, it could make them go insane. And so they would be institutionalized. So it's a sort of double-edged sword there.
Karen would like to know, when were standards and regulations developed as to the dosage allowed to be given to veterans or anyone needing medical care?
It's really not until the 20th century, long after the Civil War generation have died, and even after really their grandchildren, World War I veterans, are going through kind of similar phenomena in the 1910s and 20s. That's really when the use of these narcotics becomes more normalized in a way that there's a standard dosage and you don't give it for this long, and sort of the kinds of conditions that medical professionals today are more familiar with. That's not to say that doctors during the Gilded Age didn't try. They really did, through organizations like the American Medical Association, state medical societies. They really tried to encourage their members to be more responsible with the prescribing of these medications, to try to sort of self-regulate and get a grip on, get a handle on the opioid epidemic. But because there are no sort of laws or really effective regulations on the practice of medicine back then, it was really an effort that did not bear a ton of fruit before about 1900.
Bonnie would like to know, is your book coming out in early 2025 or early 2024? Hoping it's 24.
I wish. It looks like it's going to be 2025. When it does come out, it should be available in bookstores near you, but you could also purchase it from uncpress.org, and that's the publisher's website. I will say that that's typically where the best price is. They oftentimes have a big sale, and so that's where I would recommend purchasing from, is directly from UNC Press.
So
They
Jonathan,
haven't told me to say that either.
Jonathan, how did you get involved in this study?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember. It's been so long. So this was a project that I worked on in graduate school that started out as a totally different project. I was really curious to know, when I entered into graduate school in 2013, which dates me a little bit if there's any students watching this. But anyways, I was curious to know if Civil War veterans suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. There was no diagnostic label PTSD back then, but it seemed to me that the conditions that create PTSD were certainly present in the Civil War. And so I just wanted to know, like, did this happen? Did doctors realize that this was going on? Did veterans report things like hallucinations and feelings of uneasiness and memories of combat? And what I actually found were cases of morphine addiction. As I dug through the hospital records of the precursor to the Veterans Administration, which is created in the aftermath of the Civil War to help cope with the influx of disabled veterans, I found in these hospital records just lots and lots of cases of people that were addicted to morphine. So there were men described as morphine eaters. There were guys that were labeled by physicians as chronic morphinists. Again, all of this is before the word addiction comes into common parlance. And so they had to come up with these roundabout ways to describe addiction. Once I figured out what they were talking about, to me, it appeared that this was not, again, not just a few scattered cases, but really something bigger, a larger crisis occurring among Civil War veterans. So that's how it all started. I'm still interested, of course, in PTSD, but this to me has been a real fascinating in a dark way topic because there are so many, again, parallels between what's occurring after the Civil War and what is going on in our own society. And so one of the big wake up calls for me was as I was working on the early version of this project, I turned on the news and there was a story on the news about the opioid crisis. And what they were saying on the TV was matching what I was seeing on my computer screen where I had taken a bunch of research files. And so that encouraged me to dive into the project kind of full steam.
Yeah, Mark Twain is credited with the saying that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Yeah,
Joe,
there is a lot of rhyming in this story, unfortunately.
Joe would like to know, was the Union the greatest source of opium for the Confederacy, or did it come through the blockade?
That's a great question. It's a frustrating question too, because we just can't know. Historians, we want to know, right? We want to count, we want to quantify, but it's not in the interest of blockade runners to sort of manifest all of their cargo and hand it over to the to the Union Army. A lot of the records on the Confederate on the Confederate side, documenting like medications and things like that, are destroyed in Richmond after the Civil War. And so we just don't really know as much about the numbers in the Confederacy as we would for the Union. And so, we know where the Union is getting their opium. It seems like the most likely explanation for the Confederacy is that at first, when the blockade is relatively porous, the drug is mostly coming in through blockade runners or being smuggled over land from the land border with the Union. As the blockade tightens during the second phase of the Civil War, one thing that you can tell from Confederate newspapers is that the price of morphine and opium goes up. And so that implies that a shortage started to occur. And so at that point, it seems like more and more opium is actually coming from being captured from Union field hospitals and from Union regiments. And so here in the Shenandoah Valley, where I live, one of the main kind of things that guerrillas would do is capture supplies from the Union Army and give them to the Confederate forces out near Richmond. And so there are reports coming out of guerrilla activity like that units would seize muskets and mini balls and gunpowder and morphine. And so that became a particularly important lifeline for Confederate hospitals as well.
So I'm afraid that I actually asked you the question that Bill Miller asked.
Mm.
Paul says, I got a chuckle watching TV today. Every other ad is about this med or that med that solves everything from psoriasis to obesity. I actually recorded the number of ads for meds in a day, and there were 31 different ads. I need a life.
I'm not surprised to hear how many advertisements you saw. This has been actually a source of controversy within American medicine. Just the sheer volume of advertisements that are sent from pharmaceutical companies directly to healthcare consumers, sort of without doctors filtering in the middle, has been a real source of controversy. That's a parallel from back then, back in the Civil War era, when you didn't need a doctor to get opioids or any other kind of medicine. And so during the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, the medical profession through various means implemented kind of a rule against advertising directly to consumers. And so those drug ads were much less common in the decades between the Civil War era and our own times. But those rules were changed over the last few decades. And so it's really unleashed a lot of these annoying, advertisements that you see over and over and over again when you're watching TV.
I'm told that America is the only country allowing direct marketing from big pharma to individuals.
Yeah, it's one of the weird kind of oddities of medicine in the US is this rule that, or lack of rule, I guess, now that enables that kind of direct to consumer marketing. It's really, really fascinating.
Karen would like to know, was there an underground market for illegal drugs, or were drugs so readily available
Hmm.
nothing was illegal?
That's a great question. So in the 1800s, there are so few regulations that there really isn't a black market because everything is sort of a white market. And that is to say that you don't need to go and buy illicit or illegal drugs because you can walk down to the pharmacy and buy the same thing for cheaper. And so the idea that we have in our own society that drugs are these sort of illicit substances that you have to get through smuggling and things like that is not a thing in the 1800s. In the early 1900s, when the government, for various reasons and different reformers, including doctors, but also other kinds of characters, get really interested in what was called the anti-vice crusade. They effectively started policing different facets of 1800s life, creating these sort of black markets or underground markets for all kinds of different things. And one of those were opioids. There was actually a particularly important law in 1914 called the Harrison Act. Again, this is about 6 or 7 years before prohibition of alcohol, but it was effectively a tax on opium that was implemented in a way that unless you had a prescription for morphine or for opium, it was illegal for you to possess it. And so that, in the wake of that law, is really when we see sort of the white market and the black market separating to the point that a lot of drugs in the decades after that 1914 law are not gotten through doctors, and so they're bought on the black market.
George in Sacramento says, "Dear Professor Jones, excellent presentation and informative. Thank you."
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And Bill says, "Excellent presentation and discussion."
Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. I could talk about this all day.
And Sharon says, "Thank you for a great presentation."
Thank you.
And Robert says, "Given the number of severe wounds during the war, what is your estimate of the percentage of Union soldiers addicted to morphine from hospital records?" Really enjoying the Q&A, or opium.
This is the question that in my wildest dreams I wish I could answer. The problem, so I'll just tell you the short answer is we can't know what percentage of Union veterans suffered from addiction, because simply no one kept sort of large scale records. And so it's a problem that we will never know exactly how bad it was. And again, as a historian, I want to count things, I want to know. And so that frustrates me. We do know that the best guesstimate that I have comes from these reports by doctors and pharmacists after the Civil War that are telling their state governments, they're telling other, anybody that will listen. Again, that like that one Boston pharmacist who I quoted during the presentation, who in 1872 said, "Veteran soldiers as a class," that's a quote of his words, "are addicted to opium." And so certainly there is the perception that lots and lots of veterans, disproportionately from other groups of Americans, appear to be addicted, but we'll never know exactly how many. Weirdly, one of the twists of this story is that because there are 31 million Americans, and there are only a couple million, actually about 3 or 4 million Civil War veterans. I think 3 million, but I have a hard time keeping track of the numbers. anyways, there are many more Americans that did not serve in the Civil War, and so actually veterans as a whole were probably not the majority of addicted people in the wake of the Civil War. And so, in other words, most Americans that were using these drugs were not actually Civil War veterans. But again, there's this perception that veterans in particular struggled with the problem. I hope that's a satisfying answer. I find it somewhat unsatisfying, but I can't know the exact number.
Bonnie says we could listen to you all day too. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jason says, Professor Jones, you mentioned the Confederacy attempting poppy cultivation, but was there any history of the Union attempting the same?
Hmm. Not that I've discovered in the records. I wouldn't put it past them. This is a drug that is in such high demand, and there's so much land in the Civil War era US that's dedicated to agriculture that I would say, it's plausible that someone in the North probably tried to grow opium poppies. But most of we do know because the Union military kept better records than the Confederacy, and those records survived longer. We do know that most opium coming into the U.S. Into the North is coming through port cities like San Francisco and New York, and it's being imported.
So Jonathan and I have been talking about this presentation since April at the McCormick Civil War Institute when I met him, and we have been waiting and waiting for December to come or November to come, and it's finally here, and I think we've all really enjoyed this. Jenny says, is there any record of opium use by the officers of the armies?
Great question. Yeah. So yes and no. Obviously during the Civil War, generals are kind of like celebrities, and so people scrutinize them and criticize every move. When they win a battle, yay! When they lose a battle, oh, And so one of the kind of convenient explanations for explaining a Civil War general or colonel or even down to like the junior officer grade, one of the convenient explanations for their failures on the battlefield was drug and alcohol use. In the newspapers, in soldiers' diaries, even in court-martial records, there's this steady stream of accusations that so and so was high on opium or drunk on whiskey, and that's why they botched, their regiments or their corps or even their army's performance at any given battle. So many accusations are actually leveled that it makes it hard for historians to figure out what was true and what was not true, like what was just slander. And so what I've kind of found in my studies is that it's more important that for me, it's more interesting that people are being accused of being a so-called opium eater or opium slave than it is, whether or not they actually were using opium, because it was something that people could believe. It was so common that, when, a general was accused of being an opium eater, soldiers were like, yeah, I could see that. I could see that being real. And so it's one of those weird things. There were a considerable number of soldiers and officers that were court-martialed during the Civil War for opium and morphine use, and so that was surprisingly common among the ranks. It's easier to know for like enlisted men and for junior officers whether or not these allegations had merit because we have trial transcripts and things like that from their court-martial cases. And so certainly there was a lot of opium use in Civil War armies and hospitals. Hard to tell if any of the famous generals were actually using opium or morphine. I will say, I'll make a plug for my book here, and I will say that there's a particularly famous Civil War general from the Western theater. I won't tell you who is subject to these allegations of opium eating and goes out of his way to deny. But like I said, I won't tell you who that is yet.
Paul indicates that it might be Ewell.
There are, yeah. So I'm not actually thinking of Ewell, but there are certainly a number of commentators during the Civil War, but especially after the Civil War, that talk about Ewell. Was he using morphine? Does that help explain some of his battlefield performance? I wish I could say for sure. I don't know, but again, certainly a lot of people believed that these kinds of allegations could be true. And I think that says something about how commonplace drug use was during the Civil War.
So until your book is published, are you going to be shepherding it through the process, or have you picked up the pen and started to write something different?
Thank you for asking. I actually am, as the book project is winding down and I'm kind of passing it off to the publisher. I've started on a couple of other projects. One is a history of it's a history of Virginia Military Institute, which is where I was teaching prior to coming to James Madison. It is a project that I was actually running with some students of mine or some cadets of mine in kind of BMI lingo about expressions of the Confederacy and the lost cause on college campuses like BMI. You can actually see the early part of this project, which we just published through another organization. It's a website. And so I'll put the link to that in the chat box here in a moment. But that's one project I've been working on. I am also going to be doing a new book. My second book will be about medical fraud in the Civil War. Opium use is off the charts, but also all kinds of other weird medical scams escalate during the Civil War because so many people need healthcare that they fall victim to sort of these sort of shady, what we might call snake oil doctors. And so that's what I think my next big project is going to be.
Wow, that sounds cool.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Hey, Mike.
Yes, Paul.
I was wondering what Jonathan thought about Mercy Street.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Mercy Street. I wish it was still on the air. I could watch like 15 seasons of it. I think that there's a character in Mercy Street, I forget his name, but he's one of the surgeons operating in the hospital who injects some of his patients, and then eventually I think he injects himself with morphine. He is based on a real life Civil War doctor who experimented with hypodermic morphine early on in the Civil War by giving it to patients at Turner Lane Hospital. And so I was not involved in Mercy Street, but they have done a terrific job really getting the medical history of the Civil War and the drama of Civil War hospitals right. And so, like I said, I'm a big fan of the show.
Yeah, that was really well done.
Yeah.
So Jonathan has put that link in the chat. I would suggest that you click it and then read the articles after we sign off. And Bill says Jonathan will be speaking to the Williamsburg Civil War Roundtable on March 26th, 2024. Join us.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Well, let's let that be the last comment. Jonathan, again, thank you so very much for being with us and sharing your knowledge and expertise. This was a fabulous presentation.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
And ladies and gentlemen, I hope to see you next Friday. And I'm sure that you will enjoy Jonathan's book when it comes out, the first part of 2025. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great weekend.